Hi, I'm Tim Dr. T. Shamillard, and I'll be your instructor for this course. I'm an associate professor at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, where I teach a variety of game design and development courses. I'm also the founder of and program director for our Bachelor of Innovation in Game Design and Development degree. I have 5.5 years of indie game programming experience from a company I formed with my 2 sons, and now I do my game development in my one-man shop, Burning Teddy. So why Dr. T? Well, my name is Tim, so that makes some sense, but even more importantly, I teach lots of freshmen and sophomores. And at least here in the United States, in high school, students are trained to call their teachers Ms. Smith or Mr. Jones. So the first time one of my students raises their hand and says, Mr. T, everyone knows that's wrong. So just as a reminder, I am Dr. T, I'm not Mr. T. This course is structured into 4 weeks, and each week has an automatically graded quiz that you need to score 80% or better on to earn the certificate at the end of the course. There are also lots of exercises that aren't worth any points, but that are valuable for you for learning the course material, so you should do as many of those exercises as you can. There's also a single quest at the end of the course that gives you great practice doing more development with GameMaker. In week 1, there are 2 lessons, Getting Started, which you're doing right now, and a lesson about sprites. In week 2, which is called Do Something, we'll actually start implementing behavior in GameMaker using things called events and actions. In week 3, you'll learn how to add sound effects to your games, and you'll learn how to implement NPC movement. And then in the final week, we'll see how we can incorporate randomness into our games, and then there'll be a finishing up lecture as well. This course doesn't assume you had any previous programming experience at all. GameMaker is great because it lets us do both visual or drag and drop programming and scripting, the actual typing of characters and curly braces and those kinds of things into our code. And you'll learn how to do both of those things in GameMaker. I will say, I've been using GameMaker for over 20 years now, and for decades it was called GameMaker Studio and GameMaker Studio 2. So if you hear me say GameMaker Studio or GameMaker Studio 2 in the videos, I mean GameMaker. It's the same game development tool. This course is actually based on the beginning of our first game design and development course at UCCS. If you get stuck, you should post questions on the discussion forums, and you can also go to the web for help if you need it. In this lecture, you'll learn how to navigate one of my courses on Coursera. And although this is almost definitely not the course you're currently enrolled in, that doesn't really matter. All my courses on Coursera pretty much look the same. Let's go wander around the course. This is the first course in the specialization, and you can ignore this assessments overdue message. That's just because I'm currently editing the course. Over here on the left, you can pick the week for which you want to look at the material, and we'll take a look at week 1. So the first thing you should do for a particular week is you should read what it's all about for this week. I say module, but it's really just that week's content. You can show the learning objectives for the week so you can see what you should be able to do by the time you finish the week's work. And then you can see there's lots of videos and other materials. So if we look at the sprites lesson, we can see there are some videos that you should watch. And there are also exercises, stuff that you should do to practice with the course material. These are not automatically graded. In fact, they're not graded at all. So you can just mark them as completed when you finish them if you want. But for a particular video, like sprites and sprite strips, you can see there's the actual video. And if you scroll down, There's also a downloads section where you can download the lecture video or the subtitles or transcript. The PDF file here will be a copy of the PowerPoint slides that I used for that particular video. And if I've generated code in that video, here's a zip file with the code that I generated as I did that video. So you can always download the code that goes with a particular video by going to Downloads under the video and then picking that zip file. If you download it, you do need to extract the files from that zip file before you try to run the GameMaker games or anything like that. So you can't just run them from within the zip file. You need to extract the files from the zip file first. The other thing you can see on week 1 is there is a quiz. It says it's overdue, but it's not. But every week you'll have a quiz that you need to complete. And those quizzes are graded. I will also say that each week contains a discussion prompt. And if I click this discussion prompt, you'll see that I can type a reply to a particular prompt, something that gets you thinking about game development and the aspect of game development that we covered in this particular week, so that you can just sort of reflect on what you've learned and how it might apply to game development. If I go to week 4, every course in the specialization has an optional quest. So some game that you can develop to hone your game development skills in GameMaker even more. It's optional, it's not graded. The only thing that's graded is the quizzes, but this also lets you develop more games in addition to the small exercises you've done throughout the course. You can also, on the left, look at your current grades in the course, and I haven't submitted anything yet, so I don't have grades for any of the quizzes. You can take notes. There are also discussion forums. So I have a discussion forum for each week, and if you want to post a question or comment about the topics for that week, you just go to the discussion forum and start a thread and so on. So that's a whirlwind tour of how you actually navigate one of my Coursera courses. But even if the course you're currently in is not the first course in the specialization, they are all formatted the same way. And there you go. That's how you navigate one of my courses on Coursera. This is the totally optional, don't watch it if you don't want to, meet the instructor lecture. I'm Tim, Dr. T. Shamillard, and I grew up in a small town in southeastern Massachusetts named Norton. And after high school, I went off to Georgia Tech to pursue a bachelor's in electrical engineering degree, but I was only at Georgia Tech for a year. So if you'd like, pause the video and guess for why I only stayed for a year, and then continue. As one of my past students said, I left for the love of a good woman. So my girlfriend was in Massachusetts, Georgia Tech is in Atlanta, Georgia, and that was too far for me. So I spent about a year and a half putting stuff into boxes and handing it to the UPS guy. And then I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, went off to basic training, went to technical training school, and after about 4 months in the Air Force, I got married. So pause the lecture again if you'd like to decide whether that was the same girl I left Georgia Tech for or somebody else. The answer is it is in fact the same woman and we are still married. So here we are in the Air Force. We went off to Omaha, Nebraska for our first tour, and then after 16 months, the Air Force decided to send me to school full-time to pursue a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering at Georgia Tech. So I did get to finish that degree at Georgia Tech in electrical engineering. And then I went off to officer training school and got my commission as an Air Force officer. Our first assignment in the Air Force was at Los Angeles Air Force Base, where I spent 4 years managing contractors writing software to help us fly satellites. Particularly orbital software was my general area of expertise. We had our first 2 children, both boys, while we were in Los Angeles. And I also pursued my master's degree in computer engineering at the University of Southern California, going to school nights. Finished that tour after 4 years and went off to the U.S. Air Force Academy, where I taught undergraduate computer science courses for 2 years. Now, the Air Force Academy is usually a 4-year tour, but I only spent 2 years there. So if you'd like to pause the lecture video again and try to guess why I only spent 2 years, go ahead and do so. The answer is the Air Force decided to send me off to UMass Amherst to pursue a doctorate. So I am in fact a doctor of computer science, so I don't actually help people. And my entire family loved the part in Treasure Planet, the movie, where there's a non-medical doctor and he is trying to help somebody who's injured, and he says, "I just sit here and I'm useless." And I saw that movie with my entire family at the movie theater, and at that line, every single person leaned over and looked at me. So everyone knows I'm a doctor, just not a real doctor. Okay, so I finished off that degree and went back to the Air Force Academy for that full 4-year tour that I should have had in the first place. And then my final assignment was to Washington, D.C., where I spent a couple of years managing contractors, developing web applications, and the databases that support those web applications. And then I retired from the Air Force. So I've been at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs since 2003, and I've taught a variety of courses, including graduate-level software engineering courses, undergraduate computer science courses, and undergraduate game design and development courses, all of which I created from scratch. And in fact, we now have a Bachelor of Innovation in Game Design and Development, and I teach many of the beginning and the final course in that particular program, and I'm the program director for that program. So at this point, I exclusively teach game development courses. I also spent a year and a half as an indie game developer in a company that I formed with my 2 sons, and that's Peak Game Studios. And we did a number of games both on speculation and on contract. So here are the games we built on speculation. The 2 images on the left are a game called Ket that's based on an actual board game. So we got the license from the board game manufacturer. And you can think of this as chess with lasers. And you can actually download a free version of this game at this point from the Burning Teddy website. I'll talk about Burning Teddy soon. The other screenshot from the upper right is for a game that we didn't quite finish as we shut down the company once my sons sort of grew up and moved on to do other things. And that game is called Battle Paddles. And you should think of this as Pong with weapons, because that's sort of the big idea behind that game. We didn't quite finish it, but we'll get back to that game as well. So on this slide are the games that we built under contract. So as a company, we went and we got a contract to build some games, and we actually got paid to build them, and that was awesome. So the 2 on the left are for educational games for 8th graders. The one all the way to the left was a set of 4 mini games to teach about physics. And the title of that group of mini games was Physics with Neat Details. And if you think of the acronym for that, it's PWND. And so, of course, a little tongue-in-cheek game development, of course. And the lower one was to teach 8th graders about robotics. So they would configure a robot with various attachments to go complete a number of missions. Again, there were a few mini games to do. The upper right one is something called Colorado History Arcade. We got a contract to teach 4th graders about Colorado history, and that game was deployed on the Pikes Peak Library District website. So all of the games we built as a company, except for the Colorado History Arcade game, were using C#. We happened to use XNA Game Studio to do that. But now, of course, we've moved on to Unity. The company hasn't, but I have. And so that brings us to this next slide, where I tell you I now have a small company, and by small I mean just me, called Burning Teddy. and I use that company to publish textbooks and online courses, and of course also to do game development. So that Battle Paddles game that I showed you the screenshot from, I am in the process of porting that over from XNA Game Studio to Unity. That is about 60,000 lines of code, so it's going to take a little while to port, but at some point that will be on the Burning Teddy website, burningteddy.com. And I'm also working on another smaller casual game that is called Balloons Extreme, and I'll actually post my progress on burningteddy.com as I build that game in Unity. So Burning Teddy, all the game development I'm doing is actually in Unity. So when I'm not teaching and I'm not doing game development, what am I doing? Well, a number of different things. But one of those things is cycling. So riding a bike is one of my joys in life, I guess. So these are my 3 bikes. The blue one is the oldest one, and that's really an old bike at this point. But I used it to really get into cycling, not racing so much, but doing long rides like a number of centuries, which are 100-mile bike rides, including at the time one of the 10 toughest centuries in the United States. And so that century had over 10,000 feet of climbing. That's what makes 100-mile bike ride harder than another is, elevation gain. And so I did a number of bike rides. The mountain bike, the one on the bottom, is a result of going mountain biking with some friends one day, and I loved it so much that I went out and bought the mountain bike the next day. The bike all the way on the right is my triathlon bike. So, being a cyclist, I did a lot of long rides. I also did a bunch of running, including a number of marathons and a running race that goes from the bottom to the top of Pikes Peak here in Colorado Springs. I did that running race multiple times. And once you've biked a long time and run a long time, you say, well, you might as well do some triathlons as well. Just add a swim and you'll be fine. And so I've done a variety of triathlons, all the way from sprint distance, which are really short, all the way up to an Ironman distance race. I also play guitar. I started doing that way back in high school and then gave it up for decades while I was raising my family and doing other things. And now I've started up again to try to learn how to do it even better than I used to. So moving from left to right, the acoustic is a Yamaha acoustic that I bought way back while I was just out of high school. The next guitar is a Joe Strummer replica. Fender came out with a Joe Strummer tribute guitar some years ago, and that was my starting point. But I replaced the 3-saddle bridge with a 6-saddle bridge because that's what Joe Strummer used. I got that relict pick guard from a place called Extreme Creations, and I even took the stickers that were on Joe Strummer's guitar and cut them into the shapes that they were worn into by the time Joe stopped playing the guitar, and affixed them to the guitar in the appropriate places. The next guitar is a Gibson Les Paul Gold Top from a couple of years ago. And the one all the way on the right is my most recent guitar. That is a Fender Stratocaster American Professional 2. And I didn't have a Strat, so I wanted a Strat. But I also couldn't resist getting it in the gorgeous Miami blue color. Really, the other thing, other than, interesting, like, reading books and stuff like that, the other leisure thing I do is I play video games. That should come as no surprise to you. And so the question is, what kind of video games do I play? And you should pause the video, guess in your mind what those might be, and then you can move on to see a screenshot of what I use to play my video games. You can see racing games are my passion, so really racing simulations, so, realistic racing games rather than arcadey racing games. And if you're interested in all the details of that racing rig, you can go to the PDF that I've provided as a resource for this lecture. So there you have it. None of this has anything to do with course content, but it gives you a little more insight into who's teaching you in the course. What will you learn about in this lesson? You'll learn how to install GameMaker. You'll learn what sprites and sprite strips are. You'll learn how to import sprites and sprite strips into GameMaker. And you'll learn how to create and modify sprites and sprite strips using Paint.net. In this lecture, you'll learn how to add sprites and sprite strips to your GameMaker Studio game. Before we talk about how to do that, we should talk about what those things are. So first of all, what's a sprite? I will tell you that I've learned from harsh experience not to ask this question of my students in class or high school students I periodically visit to talk about game development, because I will get answers like, Sprite is the great taste of Lyman, a fantastic Coca-Cola product, or even worse, particularly at high schools, a guy in the back row will say, a sprite is a mythical woodland creature, and I've been trying to get his cloak for a week. And everyone in the room will sort of look like this, except the guy next to him who will say, dude, I know, me too. Okay, for us, a sprite is a graphical asset. So that means it's a PNG file or a JPEG or a GIF, something that holds graphics. I regularly use PNGs in my games because they hold transparency, and so I use PNGs all the time in my game development, but GameMaker Studio supports a number of different formats for your graphical asset. A sprite is typically a single image. When people talk about a sprite, they're regularly talking about one image in a graphic file. So what's a sprite strip? Well, a sprite strip typically consists of multiple images in that one PNG file. Let's just say PNG because that's what I use. So these are typically used for animations because each image in the sprite strip is a frame in the animation. And we'll see momentarily how easy it is to make those sprite strips into animations in GameMaker Studio. You might hear people talking about these sprite strips as sprite sheets as well, and that's a perfectly reasonable piece of terminology. It's just that GameMaker Studio talks about them as sprite strips, so that's how I'm talking about them in this lecture. But those two terms are interchangeable. Okay, let's go to GameMaker Studio and see how to import these things into our game. Okay, I've opened up GameMaker and I'm going to create a new project. It'll be a new game, and I'm going to call it Teddy Bears because I know teddy bears are involved in this game, and I'll click Let's Go. And remember our good habit of setting our default scripting language. I'll make it GML visual and saying OK. And by the way, I can get rid of this pane on the left if I want some more room by just clicking the X. I went through what this stuff on the right hand looks like last time. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to add a couple of sprites. I'm going to add a sprite that's a single frame or a single image, and I'm going to add a sprite strip. I'm going to put those sprites in the sprites folder. So I right click on that folder and I say create, and I have to fight with the magnifier and scroll down to sprite. So I'm creating a sprite and I select that, and then over here I'm going to import an image, and now I navigate to the sprite that I want to use. So I'm going to just go do that and then we'll come back. And here's that teddy bear that I was talking about, so I'm going to double click that and import it as a sprite. This is an undoable action, so I'll say yes, go ahead and do it. And I'm going to turn off that magnifier for now. And as you can see, I have my sprite here. Now it turns out that it's a really good idea to have all your sprites facing to the right, at least those sprites that you're going to have rotate within the game. And that's important because when we get to rotation and so on, we'll learn that the 0 angle is to the right. So something that has 0 rotation is actually facing to the right. And so making all your sprites just face to the right, if you're going to rotate them in your game, is a really good idea. The other really good idea is to name this something better than sprite 1. So I'm going to call this sprite teddy bear, or something like that. I'm going to call this sprite teddy bear because once we get lots and lots of sprites in our game, it's hard to keep track of them if they're just numbers, and sometimes those images on the right are harder to interpret, so giving it a good name is a really good idea. There are some things we can edit on this sprite. I'm not going to edit anything on this image at this point, but we will learn later in the course, especially this collision mask thing, because GameMaker uses the collision mask to detect collisions between objects this sprite is attached to and objects other sprites are attached to, or even multiple teddy bears bumping into each other. And so we may discover we need to tune that collision mask for a particular sprite. We don't have to here. I'm going to leave it alone. We're not doing any collision detection yet, but we will explore more the things we can do with the sprite when we need to modify some of the behavior of the objects the sprite is attached to. Okay, so that's our teddy bear. I know what this game is going to look like, so I know I want another sprite, and this one will be a sprite strip. So I'm going to say I'm going to create a sprite. Remember, sprite strips are still graphical images that we're using in our game. But instead of importing one, this time I'm going to say edit image. And really, you can build an animation out of a sprite strip in a variety of different ways, but I'm going to just show you the easiest way to do it if you have a sprite strip with an animation. So I'm going to say edit image, and then up here on the top I'm going to say image, import strip image, because I know I'm importing a sprite strip image rather than just a single sprite. And I know I'll need an explosion for these teddy bears. And now I need to do some modifications. I need to say how many frames are in the image. I need to say how many frames there are per row. And I need to say what the frame width and frame height are. And it turns out that this is a very strange size where each frame is 71 pixels wide. And then I say convert. And this is fine. I'm going to say yes. And I can even run this animation or play this animation by clicking the play button. And you can see it plays. Now if I come back to this sprite, I realize I didn't name it properly. So I can right click here and say rename, or press F2. And I will call this sprite explosion. And I will double click that. And now we come back to the sprite itself, not the actual editing the sprite. I could click edit image again and get back to where we were. But you can see that I can play it from here as well, down here with this button. And if you wanted to change it, the frames per second, make it 15 frames a second instead. That slows down the explosion and so on. Default is 30, and I'll just leave it at 30, showing you that we have a nice fast explosion animation. And that's all we need to do in GameMaker Studio to import single sprites, single images, and sprite strips for animations. This is my teddy bear sprite that I've opened up in paint.net, which is a great free software app for generating or editing 2D assets. If we look down here on the right, you can see that my art asset is 32 by 32. And you should always make sure that the width and the height of your art assets are powers of 2. It doesn't have to always be square. It doesn't always have to be 32 by 32. You can have an art asset that's 8 by 64 and so on. But you want each dimension of your art asset to be a power of 2. And this is for graphics card efficiency. Graphics cards work best if the textures or sprites that we're giving them are dimensions that are powers of 2, so you should get into that habit of doing that. You might wonder why I'm giving you art assets like this that have transparency on the left and right or top and bottom, and you'll wonder why I didn't crop it like a good artist would do, but I'm being a good game developer and making sure that the dimensions are powers of 2. To recap, in this lecture you learned what sprites and sprite strips are. You learned how to import those graphical assets into your GameMaker games. And you learned that it's important that the dimensions of those graphical assets be powers of 2. And I freely admit that in this video they were not in powers of 2, but in all the course materials I've provided to you, I've made sure that the art assets follow that rule, that each dimension is in fact a power of 2. In this lecture, you'll learn how to add objects and instances to your game. And the great thing about objects and instances is they can do stuff. Sprites are just pictures, sprite strips are just animations, but objects can actually do things in the game. Before we talk about the details, you should think of objects and instances as software representations of tangible things, like a ship or an asteroid or a weapon or a projectile, those kinds of things. Those are the kinds of things it's called modeling, we usually model as objects in our game. Okay, so what's an object? An object is a template for the instances we're going to add to our game. So think of an object as a cookie cutter. It defines the shape of the cookies that we're going to make by putting them in our game. Objects define the state and behavior of the instances. So what's state? Let's talk about a weapon. State might be, am I currently in a cooldown period? Yes or no? Or how much ammo do I have left? Those kinds of things are state. They're information about a particular instance, and the object defines those things. It also defines behavior. If I'm a weapon, how do I respond to player input, especially when they press the fire key? And so the object says how a weapon will work. An instance is an actual copy of that object that we have placed into the game. So we could have like 5 weapons in our game, right? And they all have ammo, and they all have a cooldown period, whether or not they're in cooldown, let's say for now. But each of those would have different information about that. We fired one weapon, so it only has 4 projectiles left, and another weapon we haven't, so it still has all 5 or whatever. And they all will behave to player actions as well. So the instances, the copies of this object that we put into our game. Okay, let's talk about object-oriented terminology, because some of you may have programmed in a standard object-oriented language like C# or Java or C++ or something like that, and the terminology that GameMaker uses is not the same as that standard terminology. In standard object-oriented languages, the template is called a class, not an object. And in standard object-oriented programming, the instance of a class is actually called an object. Some people call it an instance of a class, but more commonly, people call it an object. As much as it pains me to do so, throughout this course and all the courses, I'm going to use GameMaker terminology when I talk about objects and instances. But please don't be confused if you're used to standard object-oriented terminology. I'm going to use the GameMaker terminology because that's how GameMaker talks about these things. Let's go to GameMaker and see how this works. We're going to start with the game I created in the previous lecture. So over here in the recent projects, you can see I can pick teddy bears. So I've selected teddy bears. It brings me back where I was before. And now I want to add an object, an entity that can do something in the game. I'm going to right-click Objects, Create, and say I want to create an object. Before I forget, I'm going to change its name to Object Teddy Bear. because I know that this is going to be a teddy bear. Now, it is possible to have objects in your game that don't actually have a sprite associated with them, and that makes perfect sense. For example, we might have a spawner, something that we've placed in the game as a spawn point, but it doesn't have any graphical representation, it just spawns stuff into the game. So not all objects have sprites, but really most objects have sprites, and certainly our teddy bear will have a sprite. So I'm going to say here under sprite, I'm going to click these three dots and I get to go find my sprite here in the project. I know I put it in the sprites folder, and so I just clicked there and grabbed it. That went pretty fast, so let me show you that the sprite explosion was there as well, but I wanted the teddy bear sprite. You might think at this point that we would see a teddy bear when we run the game, but we won't because we haven't added that object to a room. And we have a room here called room 1. So I will double click that, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit by doing Control middle mouse wheel. And now I can add some teddy bears to my room. Now it turns out that there are some room settings over here on the left that appeared when I actually brought up the room. So we're going to leave them the way they are, but this width and height of 1366 and 768 is sort of weird on a PC, but not necessarily on some mobile devices and so on. We'll just leave it the way it is, but you should know that you can come over here and you can modify those things. So I can now run my game, and I can click this arrow up near the upper left, or I can press F5 to run the game. This is just a bunch of messages that tell us what's happening as we're getting ready to run a game, and then here's our game. I'll close the game window, I'll close the output window, and I will point out that if I wanted to really make you feel bad, I could click background, and I could change my background color to be this really horrible magenta color instead. And then if I run my game again, this really hurts your eyes. I'm going to not do that to you. I'm going to change this back to black. Now we're back in black. And we can run it one more time just to show that I didn't break anything and that it's the way I wanted it to be. Now that may seem strange to you when I said, well, I'll run it again to make sure I didn't break anything. I just clicked one thing. But you should end up in a pattern of doing stuff in your game and then testing it, and doing stuff in your game and testing it. Really small bits of changes that you test to make sure that you haven't broken anything when you made those tiny changes. Because if you did break something, it's a really good possibility that what you broke is what you were just messing around with. So I've had students come to my office hours and say, you know, my game's not working. And I say, when did it last work? And they say, well, I haven't tried it. I just, I built it and then I tried it. And I look and they have, 50 objects and all kinds of stuff. And it's really hard to figure out what's wrong, right? Whereas if you say, well, I added the teddy bear and then it broke, then we can look at the teddy bear. So we build and test in small pieces as we do our game development. Now, you might be a little less than enthusiastic about objects and their potential at this point because I said these are entities that can do stuff in the game, but these teddy bears just sit there not doing anything. We will actually get to having teddy bears have behavior in the next lecture. To recap, in this lecture, you learned about the difference between objects, the template for instances we're going to place into our game, and the actual instances that are in our game. And we learned that objects can actually do things while sprites, for example, can't. In this lecture, we won't just destroy teddy bears when the mouse enters them, we'll turn them into explosions instead. Let's go do that now. This is where we left off previously in our drag and drop game. So we've decided that we're going to convert our teddy bear to an explosion instead of just removing it from the game when the mouse enters it. I'll get rid of this code. We're going to get rid of this destroy instance because that's not what we're going to do anymore. I need to create an explosion object that we can convert into. So I will call this object explosion. And now I will come back to, well, and now I'll give it the explosion sprite. And back on the teddy bear, on mouse enter, I will find something else to do with instances. And that something else, as you can see, you get flyover help, if you will, when you go on top of each of these icons. And this one says changes an instance to be an instance of another object. And that's exactly what we want. But we don't want to turn into a no one object. So I'll click this select a resource button here on the right. And now I can pick amongst the objects I have in my game. And I want to turn it into an explosion. Now when I run my game, I get an explosion instead. So multiple things wrong here. First of all, the explosion keeps on going. And second of all, you can see it's not centered on the teddy bear. Let's take care of that first one first. That is the mistake that I left and said I was leaving on purpose. So the explosion sprite has its origin at the top left, and we don't want that. We want it in the middle center instead. So if I run my game again now, the explosion is centered on the teddy bear, which is nice. So you may have noticed that I've never killed the last teddy bear. And for some of you, that's problematic, right? You want to somehow grab my mouse and kill it because that's how this game should be played, and I'm not doing it right. I will tell you, I've done presentations with this game in the past, and one time I was doing that presentation and somebody said, "Please don't kill that last teddy bear. I've already named it." And of course, that was my impetus to actually kill the last teddy bear. So I promise, once we're done with this game, I'll kill all 4 teddy bears. Okay, the other thing is the explosion just keeps on playing. And time for a disclaimer. Nothing that I say can be used against UCCS or me personally. If you had a teddy bear that was stuffed with C4, this is not how it would blow up, right? It would just explode and then it would stop. So we want to do that as well. And we can do that in the explosion object. We'll add an event, and this is an other event. And the event we want to respond to is animation end. So when the animation ends for the explosion, I'm going to destroy the instance. You've seen me grab actions from down below. You'll also see there's a recently used area up above, and you can get it wherever you want, but I want to destroy the explosion when it finishes playing its animation. So let's F5 to see how that works. And finally, I'll blow up the last one for you. There you go. That is converting our teddy bear into a different object. Let's go over to our GameMaker language project. So we know for mouse enter, we don't want to do instance destroy anymore. And as you can see on the right, I already made myself an object explosion in this project. So I need something different from instance destroy. So let's go use the documentation in the GameMaker manual to help us here. We'll say help, open manual. And we know that we're trying to do something with instances. So let's search on instances. And that's our second hit. And we can look at these and see if any of these functions look like something that will help us. And certainly instance change looks like a good candidate for this. So I'll click this. And remember, functions are chunks of code that we can call to have them do something. And this changes one instance into another instance of a different object. So this is exactly what we were doing in our visual game. If we look at the syntax, we see that we call this function with 2 arguments. We pass in the object that the current object is going to change into, so that's the explosion. And we pass in a Boolean, so true or false, called perf, whether to perform that new object create and destroy events. So in this particular game right now, we don't need to do that. So when we call the function, we'll type in false for that argument. But there are other examples even later in this course where we'll decide that false was the incorrect choice and we want to pass in true instead. So this just tells whether or not the object will do the things that it does in response to the create event. And instead of the instance destroy, I'll change, and the first argument is the name of the object I want to change into. And as I said, I'm going to say false. It doesn't have to run things in response to the create event. Okay, so I'll run the game. Actually, I'll go to my sprites and I will center the explosion sprite. And now I'll run my game. And we can see I've done that first step in GML now instead of in drag and drop. The next thing we want to do though is in the explosion object, when the animation ends, remember that's an other animation end, we want to do something, and here is where we instance destroy. So the explosion will destroy itself once its animation ends. Let's run that one more time. And there, it works the way we expected it to work. To recap, in this lecture, you learned how to change one object to a different object, and you also learned how to destroy an object when its animation ends. In this lecture, you'll learn about events in GameMaker Studio and how we can respond to events through actions. So what's an event? An event is something that happens in the game. Maybe the user has provided input, maybe two objects in the game world have collided with each other, maybe a timer has expired, and lots of other scenarios. But the big idea is an event is something that happens. What's an action? An action is a response to an event that occurred. So if a certain event occurs, we might decide to destroy an object, we might decide to reduce the health of something, we might pick up the object that we've just collided with, and lots of other examples of actions that we can perform. But the big idea is that we perform one or more actions to respond to a specific event that has happened in our game. Let's go take a look. Okay, here's where we left off last time, and we have these teddy bears, but they don't do anything. So let's actually change the behavior of all the teddy bears. Remember when we talked about objects and instances? This object is the template, but it doesn't exist in the game. We have these instances of the objects. You'll notice they highlight over there on the left as I click them, or if I click it here, it highlights over on the right. But these four teddy bears in the room are actually the instances of this object. But because this object is the template for them, if I change the behavior of the object, it changes the behavior of all the instances. Let's see how that works. And we'll see how it works by interacting with the event system. I'm going to get rid of this room editor for now, so I have a slightly larger workspace, and I'm going to move around by holding down my middle mouse wheel and dragging, and I want to add an event here. So if I say add an event, there are a whole bunch of events that are available in GameMaker Studio. The create event happens when the object is added to the room as the room starts up. The destroy event occurs when the object is being destroyed. There are step events that we'll see later. There are alarms we can listen for. We won't really worry about the draw event in the games we create in this course. The mouse, we may have things like the left mouse is down over this object, and this is one of those instances where that collision mask matters because the collision mask is the thing that's tested against. We're going to actually do mouse enter. That's the event we're going to respond to, but as you can see, there are other things as well. Key down, key pressed, key up. We'll skip gestures because we're not working on mobile in this class. Collisions with objects, like another teddy bear, what happens if two of them collide, and so on, and even other. Let's go to mouse and say when the mouse enters the collider for the teddy bear. And look what happens if we forgot to set our project to always use GML code or GML visual when we created the project. So I can say use GML visual because that's what we're using right now. We're using drag and drop, and I won't check this box that says don't ask again for this project. So I'll say OK, and we'll be able to add actions for the mouse enter event. If I add another event, like create, for example, it's going to ask me again. So I would have to say GML visual again. You could click this checkbox and then it will never ask again for this project, but it's really easier to just set the scripting language for the project right after you've created the project. I'll say OK here. I'll actually delete this event by right-clicking it and saying delete event because I don't really need that. In this particular case, all I'm going to do is I'm going to destroy the teddy bear. So when the mouse enters an instance of the teddy bear, because this is in the object, this is the behavior of all teddy bear instances, the teddy bear instance will be destroyed. Let's watch that happen. So here's my mouse, and when I enter a teddy bear, it goes away. And of course that works for all the instances, not just that one. And that is responding to an event with a particular action, where the event is mouse enter and the action is destroy instance. To recap, in this lecture you learned that events are things that happen in the game. You've learned that actions are ways that we respond to those events. And I should tell you that this whole idea of an event system, events that occur and actions that we take to respond to those events are integral to pretty much every game and every game engine we use for our game development. The terminology might be different, although Unity, for example, calls events events and so on, and actions actions, but the ideas are the same. Stuff happens, and we respond to that stuff that happens, and that is a pattern that we see throughout game development. There's still something missing from our explosion, and that's sound. So in this lecture, we're going to add a sound effect for our explosion. There's actually a story behind this particular sound effect. I was teaching an audio lesson in an in-person classroom, and I foolishly said, "Does anyone want to record a sound?" And of course, I had a student in the back row raise his hand and say, "Yes, I want to do it." And even though I'm an experienced, seasoned professor, I said, "Sure, go ahead." And he came up and he recorded this sound, and that's what we're going to use for our explosion. Now, two things. First of all, no matter what you think this sound is, you're wrong. Second of all, some of you may have thought, well, if I had that opportunity, I know what sound I would have recorded, and that's wrong too. Let's go get our sound effect put into the game. Okay, here we are in our drag and drop project. So I'm going to go over to the sounds folder, and I'll right click and I'll create a sound. And I will call this sound explosion because I'm comfortable lying to you at this point. I'm going to navigate to the sound file and then we'll come back. So I will just select mystery sound here. And now I have it called sound explosion in my game. So we want to play this explosion when the explosion object gets created. And we can do that in one of two places. We know that the object teddy bear changes instance to an object explosion, so we could in fact play the sound here, or we could play the sound in the explosion object. And one of the important things to do as you're developing games is decide which object should do stuff. And the guiding principle should be each object is responsible for its own behavior. So the explosion is really the right choice here for playing that sound. I'm going to add an event, and this is the create event. So when the explosion is created, I'm going to play this sound. So over here in the action toolbox, I need to find the action for playing a sound. And this is really, you learn more and more about which actions are available and where they are as you use GameMaker Studio. So I'm just going to scroll down slowly until I find something that seems right. And audio certainly seems like the right thing. So you sort of hover over things until you find the one you want. And of course, it's the very first one. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to pick the sound I want to play. And I only have one. And I could choose to loop, but I'm not going to. Okay, here we go. This is very exciting, isn't it? Let's see what that sound effect is. And there you have it. Now we have a sound effect playing in our game. And of course, I can overlap the sounds as well for that disturbing experience. And that's all you have to do to play a sound effect in your game. You create a sound asset, and then you can use play audio to actually play that sound. Let's see how to do the same exact thing in our GML project. So in our GML project, we're definitely going to do this in the explosion object again. I will add the create event here. And as always, we don't really know what it is we should do here. So let's check out the GameMaker manual. And we'll search on audio because we know we're dealing with audio. And let's pick audio down here. That should give us a selection of the functions that we can call. And if we look at using audio, it says the most straightforward way to play sound is using audio play sound. So let's go take a look at that. And there are a lot of arguments we provide when we call this function. We provide the index, which is really the name of the sound we want to play. We provide a priority. That's the channel priority for the sound, and lower numbers are higher priority, so we'll just pick 0 when we call this. And we tell, as a Boolean, true or false, whether or not we want to loop. And for the sound effects that we're playing right now, we don't want to loop them. So that gives us all the information that we need to provide when we call this function. You'll notice that there are 4 other parameters here in the function. So there are 4 other arguments that we could provide when we call this function, but they're all optional and we're not going to need to use them when we play the sound. So we'll just call the audio play sound function with 3 arguments: the index, the priority, and whether or not to loop. So here we will say audio play sound. Remember, we provide the name of the sound, and I called it sound explosion. We provide its priority, which I'll make top priority, and we'll say it doesn't loop. And when we go ahead and run our code, it doesn't play the sound. So let's think about why this could be happening. We're playing the explosion sound in the create event for the explosion. And you may remember that I said when we changed the instance from the teddy bear to the explosion, we provided 2 arguments to this function call. The first one was the name of the object we wanted to convert to, and the second one was true if we wanted to respond to the create event in the new object, and false if we don't. And of course, we do want to respond to that create event in the explosion object now that we've added functionality for that create event. So I'm going to change this false to true. And we'll run again. And as you can see, we now get the sound effect playing in our GameMaker language project. To recap, in this lecture, we learned how to add sound effects to our game, and we also learned that professors should be careful when they ask for volunteers in class. In this lecture, you'll learn how to install and use Audacity. Audacity is a great free tool for manipulating sound files. Let's go take a look. We'll start by installing Audacity. So go to your favorite browser and your favorite search engine and type in Audacity, download. And you can download for Windows, for example. I'm on a Windows machine, so I'm on a 64-bit Windows machine, so I would download this exe right here, and then you'd go to your downloads folder and double-click that exe and install Audacity. So that's a pretty easy installation process. Once you have Audacity downloaded and installed, you can run it to process your audio files. So let's go do that now. I've opened up Audacity and I've opened up a clip that I recorded for us to process. So I'm going to not talk while I play this clip so you can hear what it originally sounds like. I'm recording this clip so that we can manipulate it using Audacity. And there are a number of common things that we might want to do with an audio clip. When we're applying effects to an audio clip, we need to select the clip or the part of the clip that we want to manipulate. I can just drag my mouse across a section of the clip to just process that clip. I usually just do Control A and grab the whole clip. So what can we do with the clip? Some of the common things we do are, if we go up to Effect and pick Amplify, we might amplify the clip so it's louder. I'll play it again without talking so you can see what that did. Well, before I play it again, you can obviously see what it did. It increased the amplitude of the sound wave, so it will be louder when I play it. I'm recording this clip so that we can manipulate it using Audacity. You can see there's lots of variation in the volume as I was talking in that clip. So another thing that we can do to sort of level that out is to say Effect, Distortion, and there are lots of distortion types we can pick, but I usually pick Leveler. As a matter of fact, this is exactly the process I go through to process the audio from the recordings for all my videos. So you get to see the process I'm following to sort of smooth out the audio and make it high quality for the videos. So we can level it and we can modify a number of characteristics of the leveling. And if I click Apply, you can see that some of the volume went up and some of the volume went down, but this is leveled out some based on those characteristics to make the volume more consistent. I'll play it again. I'm recording this clip so that we can manipulate it using Audacity. So another thing you may have noticed is this is not flat here or here. We have some noise there, and I deliberately added that noise there. And it would be nice if we could get rid of that noise throughout the recording, not just in those areas. And there is, of course, a way to do that. So I'm going to select part of the noisy part, and then I'll say Effect, Noise Reduction, and step 1, we need to get the noise profile. So Audacity needs to know, what does the noise sound like that you want to get rid of? Now that I've selected the noisy part, I can select the entire clip and do Effect, Noise Reduction again, and this time I'll just say OK. And again, you have some characteristics you can mess around with if you'd like. And you'll see it flattened out the noisy part a lot. It also modified the audio a little bit, so you have to listen to it and decide if that's acceptable to you or not. I'm recording this clip so that we can manipulate it using Audacity. And the last thing I'll show you is you may realize that you have a head and a tail on your audio that you don't actually want. Particularly for sound effects, we're going to probably want to not have a lot of dead air at the beginning or the end. And that's probably true for background music and all the other parts of the audio we put in our games as well. So I'm going to select the front part of this clip, and I will say Edit, Delete. I can also do Edit, Cut. Either one of those gets rid of that. And I just use Control X there to get rid of that. And I think I'll save, which I just did with Control S. I'll go to the beginning, and our final clip sounds like this. I'm recording this clip so that we can manipulate it using Audacity. And there you go. That's how we can use Audacity to do some of the standard audio processing things we might want to do with our sound effects and music in our games. To recap, in this lecture you learned that Audacity is a great free tool for manipulating sound files. And although I showed you a few things we can do with Audacity, I've really only scratched the surface of Audacity's capabilities. So if you want to explore those capabilities more, by all means you should go ahead and do so. What will you learn in this lesson? You'll learn about some of the built-in variables we have available to us in GameMaker. You'll learn how to get NPCs moving in your game, and you'll learn about screen wrapping. In this lecture, you'll learn about some of the built-in variables we have available to us in GameMaker. So what's a variable? A variable is a named location in memory that can store a value. And this is really useful to us if we need to save data for later use. In this lecture, we'll look at some of the built-in variables in GameMaker, and later you'll learn that you can actually declare your own variables as well. One kind of variable in GameMaker is called an instance variable. And the built-in instance variables give us information about a particular instance in the room. We can learn information about the sprite for that instance, or the collision mask for that instance, or information about movement and position for that instance, and more. The way we find out about these built-in variables is we search on instances in the GameMaker manual, so let's go do that. As I said, we'll search on instances in the GameMaker manual, and I'll pick instances, and I can scroll down to instance variables, and I'll select that. And as you can see, we have a number of variables that tell us about a particular instance. We can find out its ID, whether it's visible or not, whether it's solid or not, and we can find out its direction, we can find out its horizontal speed, its vertical speed, its overall speed, we can find out its current X and Y, we can find out where it started for X and Y, and we can even find out the X and Y that the instance had on the previous step or previous frame in the game, which can be helpful to us if we want to back our instance up to where it was on the previous frame. So there are lots of things that we can find out about an instance by using these built-in instance variables. Another kind of built-in variable we have in GameMaker is called a room variable, and this gives us information about the current room. So we can find out the room index for the current room, we can find out the dimensions for the current room, so the width and height of the room, and we can also find out whether or not the room is persistent. To find out about these built-in variables, we can search on rooms in the GameMaker manual, so let's go take a look. Let's go ahead and search on rooms in the GameMaker manual, and I'll pick rooms, and as you can see, there are a number of things we can find out about a particular room. The ones that we'll actually use most commonly are room height and room width to find out the dimensions of the room, but there are other things we can find out as well, like if the room is persistent. And making a room persistent makes it so that if a room is persistent, you can leave the room and come back, and all the instances in your room are where they were when you left the room, as opposed to just entering the room and everything's cleanly placed where they were when you built the room in the editor, rather than as you were running the game. This is certainly less commonly used than room height and room width. To recap, in this lecture you learned what variables are, you learned about some of the built-in variables we have available to us in GameMaker, and you also got some practice navigating the GameMaker manual. At this point, all of our teddy bears are going in the same direction. Let's make our game a little more challenging by making each teddy bear go in a random direction. Here in our teddy bear object, we'll go to the create event, and instead of setting a fixed direction, we can do this a number of different ways. Actually, we can set a variable, assign a value to a variable, which we saw in our GML code. So one way I could do this is, in fact, I'll show you how this works even if we're leaving it the way it was before, and you'll notice I get this pop-up that says direction is a built-in variable. So if I do this, I get exactly the behavior I had before. I've just directly manipulated the built-in variable rather than using that drag and drop direction thing. I can also, if you're more comfortable doing it this way, I can set the direction variable here and set it to 0. So this is still going to be the same behavior that we had before. But what I really want this direction to be is some random number. And even though I'm here in drag and drop, I can actually call GameMaker language functions from within these boxes in my drag and drop game. Let's go to the GameMaker manual to see how we can get some randomness added to our game. And I'll just search on random, and I'll pick the very first hit. And this function looks like exactly what we need. So we need to get a random floating point number between 0 and the specified upper limit. So when we call this function, we provide one argument, and the argument we provide is the upper range from which the random number will be selected. Let's go call this function from our game. We can generate an angle back in our game by saying random 360. And this will generate some random number between 0 degrees and 360 degrees and set the direction to be that. And remember, this will happen in each of our instances, so each of our instances in the room will go in a different direction. Let's watch that happen. And there you go. And as you can see, they wrap and everything, which is just what they should do. Over in our GML game, this is even easier because we've already read the documentation. So instead of setting our direction to 0, we'll set it to random 360. And when we run our game, all the teddy bears are going in different directions. To recap, in this lecture we learned how to add some randomness to our games. At this point, our teddy bear game isn't very challenging. I could only play it for an hour or two before getting bored. Okay, some of you might believe that. Wow, he seems really slow. But no, I'm bored already, even though we have that great explosion sound effect when I blow up the teddy bears. So let's actually make the game a little more challenging. And one way to make the game more challenging is to actually make the teddy bears move. So let's go do that now. Because it's the teddy bears that we want to start moving, we'll go to the teddy bear object. And we're already responding to the mouse enter event in that teddy bear object. By the way, I wanted to comment, I still have this room editor on the left and I have this assets browser on the right and so on. If that feels too crowded for you, you can click this button to collapse and expand the dock panels. And then I have sort of the full workspace in which to work. I usually don't do that, but you can if you feel sort of cramped with all these docks hanging around. Okay, I want to start the teddy bear moving when it's added to the room. So the create event occurs when this object is added to the room. And let's look at movement, because we want to move our teddy bear. There are a variety of different ways that we can do this. We could set a fixed direction, which we're going to do. We want to set two things. We want to set the direction and we want to set the speed. So we'll start by setting the direction and we'll just go to the right and we'll set the speed to be some number. Let's just pick 5 and you can mess around with this and you can sort of see how well it works for you, and you can tune your game by setting the speed how you want it to be. Let's go ahead and run the game. And there you go. All the teddy bears, well, they've all left now. Let me try that again. Maybe I can kill a few before they get away. And that's it. That is getting teddy bears moving when we start the game. Let's see what that looks like in our GameMaker language project. And again, we need to do this in the teddy bear object. Same event we're responding to, but we are going to set direction equal to 0. Remember when I was talking about sprites that I said to the right is 0? So we want to set our direction here to be 0. And the direction in GameMaker Studio is in degrees. So that tells you should have a range between 0 and 360. We set our speed to 5, so I'll set speed equal to 5. So here it is more clear to us that we are interacting with, and in fact we are assigning values to, some of the built-in variables that we talked about. Direction is a built-in variable that every instance has. Speed is a built-in variable that every instance has. So we can assign values to those built-in variables to control the behavior of our game. Let's go ahead and run it. And we see exactly the same behavior as we had before. Now, I'm going to actually disable the sound playing, because as we continue developing the game, that may be irritating to us. So if I come to the explosion, I can just add 2 slashes in front of the audio play sound function call, and that makes it a comment. And comments don't get executed when I run my game. So if I run my game here, I can explode teddy bears, but the sound effect isn't played. I'll turn that off and on as I believe it's necessary, but that's a way to make some of your code not execute. Over here in the drag and drop project, we can actually take this action, and if we right click it, we can say disable. So I haven't deleted it because I might want to turn it on again later. So this is like commenting out that GML code. And just to show you this works, I'll run the game. And as you can see, I exploded the teddy bear with no sound. To recap, in this lecture, we learned how to use two built-in GameMaker Studio variables, direction and speed, to get our teddy bears moving. In the previous lecture, we learned how to make our teddy bears move. Unfortunately, now, once they leave the room, they're gone forever. Let's fix that now. Because we're affecting the behavior of the teddy bears, this functionality goes in the teddy bear object, and we should look at the events to find one that is appropriate for when we should screen wrap. And it turns out that it's down here in Other, and we want outside room. We don't want to screen wrap when the teddy bears intersect the boundary of the room, because when the teddy bears hit the right edge, as soon as the front of their head hit the right edge, we'd screen wrap, and so they'd pop out of the game and come back in. We want to wait until they're completely outside the room. So the event we're responding to is outside room. And again, movement is the thing we want. And this is screen wrapping. So we can say we want to wrap around the room, and we could have a margin, but we don't want to. You can explore that on your own if you want, but I always leave the margin as 0. And I want to wrap both horizontally and vertically, even though we know at this point the teddy bears are only going horizontally. We're going to change that soon. So when I run the game, you can see that the teddy bears now screen wrap. Over in our GML game, we're going to do the teddy bear again, and we're going to do it when they're outside the room. And now we need to know what function to call to do that. Let's go to the GameMaker manual to see how we can screen wrap using code. And we know that screen wrapping is related to movement. So we'll search on movement, and we'll pick the first hit, and we'll scroll down looking for functions, and you'll notice that there is a move wrap function. So if we select this function, we see that it will wrap an instance that's left the room, either horizontally or vertically or both. So we're going to want to wrap horizontally. So we'll provide true as our first argument. We're going to want to wrap vertically, so we'll provide true as our second argument, and we won't need a margin. We're going to want to wrap as soon as the object has left the room, which is when the outside room event will occur or be invoked. So we're not going to have the object move a certain number of pixels outside the room before we wrap. So our margin will be 0 when we call this function. Move wrap. We want to wrap horizontally. We want to wrap vertically. And we want our margin to be 0. And as you can see, we're screen wrapping in our GameMaker language project as well. To recap, in this lecture, we learned how to make our teddy bears screen wrap. Okay, so now we have our teddy bears moving in different directions, but they're not facing in the direction they're moving. In other words, they're not looking where they're going. Let's fix that in this lecture. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to do a visual manipulation, right? A manipulation of what this instance looks like, not its behavior. But it's still in the instances section of the toolbox. And if you look at this one in particular, you can set the rotation of an instance. And what that actually means is the rotation of the object. So you're rotating around its origin. That's why it's important that we have it centered, right? The sprite has middle center selected, but we can set the rotation of the instance. And if we make the angle our direction, then when I run, you'll see the teddy bears now all face, one of them ran through the mouse. You can see that the teddy bears actually face where they're going. Now the order matters here, right? If we do this up here instead, like this, when we run our game, everything is still wrong. I'm leaving my mouse in a horrible spot, but the teddy bears aren't facing the way they're going because at this point, direction is still 0. So we want to set direction first, and I could put this here in between the two like this, or I could put it at the end, whatever, but I need to set the rotation in the direction angle after I've actually set the direction. Running again, just to make sure I didn't break it. And there you go. So we want to do the same thing over here in our GameMaker language project, but we don't know what function to call. We'll just take a look at the live preview here to see what GML function the instance rotation was, and we see that this is the code for it. So we'll add that same code here, and when we run our game, all of our teddy bears are facing where they're going. And I had to explode one just because I had to explode one. To recap, in this lecture we learned how to use another built-in variable, image angle, to rotate our object to face in the direction it's moving. You may not have noticed this, but each time we run our game, our teddy bears go in the same random directions. They go in different directions from each other, but each teddy bear always goes in the same direction as it did the last time we ran the game. Let's talk about why that happens. Computers don't actually generate random numbers. They generate numbers called pseudo-random numbers. And the reason they're called pseudo-random is because there are two components to generating these numbers. The first is a seed, some starting number for generating a sequence of pseudo-random numbers. The other thing is an algorithm, some sequence of steps that we use to take the current random number and generate the next random number, or even the history of random numbers and the next random number, but some specified sequence of steps to generate those numbers. They're called pseudo-random because if we know the seed and we know the algorithm, we can predict with perfect accuracy the sequence of random numbers we're going to get. In GameMaker Studio, the default for the random number generator is that it always starts with the same seed. And because the algorithm is the same, it's hard-coded into the GameMaker Studio environment. If we always start with the same seed, we always end up with the same sequence of random numbers every time we run the game. This can be really useful for debugging. If we find a problem, then we can always get to that problem even though there's randomness in our games. But it's really not what we want in a game that we're going to ship. So let's see how we can fix that in this lecture. Okay, I'm going to show you that behavior that I talked about. Watch where the teddy bears are going. And I'll run it again. And those teddy bears are going in the same direction they were on the previous run of the game. So even though each teddy bear is going in a random direction, every time we play the game, we get the same exact sequence of random numbers. And that's no good, right? You don't want that to happen in your game. So we need to initialize that random number generator, and we're going to do that with a separate object. It doesn't make sense to do it in a teddy bear object, for example, because we'd end up initializing that random number generator as many times as we have teddy bears, but we do need to initialize the random number generator before teddy bears start calling random functions. I'm going to get rid of this code because we don't need it anymore. I'm going to create an object, and I'll call this object random. And this is one of those instances where I don't need a sprite. The job of this object is to initialize the random number generator. So when this object is created, I'm going to now scroll through my toolbox looking for something that talks about random. I'll give you a hint. I'm looking for dice. And there, way down here, there are 3 drag and drop options. I can get a random number. I can randomize. So this is exactly what I need. I need to create a new random seed. And then I could randomly choose, but that's not what I want. So I'm going to say randomize, which initializes my random number generator. I have to remember to put this object in a room. If this object is not in the room, then it's never going to do anything. So I'm going to zoom out here, and this is not required, but I'm going to place my object with no sprite in the lower left-hand corner of the room. You can put it wherever you want, but I like to keep those non-sprite objects over in the same place every time so I can easily find them. Now, I'm going to run the game again. And it would be reasonable for you at this point to say, Dr. T has no idea what he's doing because he gave this big talk and said, here's how we do it, and those teddy bears are still going in the same direction. Here's the problem. We have no guarantee about what order these objects are placed in the room. So all the teddy bears get placed in the room first, and then we get this object random thing, and it's too late. It's too late to initialize the random number seed at this point. I'm going to do this in a fairly standard way. In game development, it is often the case that we have initial scenes or rooms or hidden stuff that does some initialization of our game before we actually get to the game. That functionality is often included in a loading screen. We don't need a loading screen, but I do want to add a room. And I'm going to call this room initialize. And I'm going to place the random object in this room. And I might as well rename room 1 as well, because now room 1 is less descriptive, and I'll just call it gameplay. Once you start having multiple rooms, you want to give them reasonable names. Now, the editor put the rooms in alphabetical order. So if I run the game, and actually I should go to my gameplay room and get rid of this object. I've just selected it and I'll delete it. If I run my game, it's going to start at the top room. It won't actually run the initialized room. It will start at the top room. But I can modify the order in which rooms run by clicking here next to one of the rooms, and I can change the room order. So I can drag a gameplay below initialize, and that will make initialize go first. I've just realized that I still have a problem. Let's go ahead and run it so you can see the problem. Here I am in my initialize room. I've set the random seed, and now I just sit here and I don't get to play. So I'm actually going to change my random object to call it a different name, first of all, and I'm going to call it initializer instead. And I'm going to have it do 2 things on creation. I'll set the random number seed, and then I'm going to move to the next room. So here's in the rooms section of the toolbox, I can actually say which room I want to go to, which is sometimes good if you have lots of rooms and you can't put them in order, like you branch between them and so on. You can go to the next room, the previous room, and so on. I'm actually going to say which room I want to go to, and the room I want to go to is gameplay. Now, when I run the game, you can see the teddy bears are going in different directions. So pay attention to what they're doing. And as you can see, or I hope you realize, those are actually different random directions. I'll do it one more time. So this is a good way to make it so that you get a different set of random numbers every time you run the game. Over here in my GameMaker language project, I'll still add the create event because we want this stuff to happen here. First thing I want to do is initialize the random number generator seed. I happen to know that that function name is randomize, We could go look it up in the documentation if you didn't know that. And the next thing we need to do is go to the next room. It would be reasonable for me to go read the documentation to try to find out how to go to the next room, but I'm going to make an educated guess here and say it's probably room underscore something, and it turns out that it is. So here I have a room goto function where I provide, it said num for number, but I provide the name of the room that I want to go to. And now when I run this, I start in the initialize room, and then I set the random number seed, and then I go to the gameplay room. I'm going to run it again just to show you that it is in fact different directions that are being generated for the teddy bears, and hopefully you can see that that's the case. To recap, in this lecture we learned how pseudo-random number generators work, and we learned how to get better randomness in our GameMaker Studio games. Great job making it to the end of the course. I hope you had a lot of fun in the course, and I hope you learned a lot as well. As a reminder, in this course, you learned about sprites and sprite strips. You learned how to respond to events with either actions in your visual games or code in your code games. You learned how to add sound effects to your games. You learned how to implement NPC movement, and you learned how to add randomness to your games. There's still lots to learn about developing games in GameMaker, so if you'd like to continue learning in a structured environment, you should move on to the next course in this specialization. I hope to see you there. No matter what, I want to thank you for joining me in this course on Coursera. I love doing these courses on Coursera, and I'm glad you joined me on your journey of exploration about game development with GameMaker. Cheers! What will you learn in this lesson? You'll learn how to implement randomness in specific objects. You'll learn how to make objects rotate, and you'll learn how to make randomness work properly throughout your game.